Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Tote Board and IPS, we welcome you to Transforming the Non-Profit Sector conference series. This is the kickoff event, and that's a mouthful. It's a mouthful, and the theme this year is also a mouthful. The theme this year is called Solutions That Help Us Help One Another, which is verbose and repetitive, but in tradition with last year's conference, which is called Good Enough Evidence for Social Good. So last year was all about how is it necessary to do the most rigorous and robust kinds of research and evaluation for purposes of your social programs, or can we get to good enough? This year, it's about mutual aid and the commons. And the reason why we chose this is because the commons is a concept that is not commonly understood. Unfortunately, but it has the promise is that it's a unifying concept that pulls together different threads. And to me, an energizing concept. So we have two speakers today with us, David Bollier and Will Ruddick. I'll introduce them later, but I'll kind of set the context for why we're here. Prior to this session, I had a conversation with Colin Rochester from the University of Kent. Now he's a kind of a long-time veteran of the UK voluntary sector, and he's kind of become an academic. And he wrote a book called Reimagining the Voluntary Sector. And he framed the voluntary sector as such that there are different parts and bits of it. There's the impulse from above, which is what we understand, which is philanthropy, funding increasingly professionalized social services. And that's what we're familiar with today. But he also says that there is this impulse from below, the mutual aid, the ground-up initiatives and the community initiatives, which are neglected both by scholars and not well understood. And for the people who think about, for policymakers who think about them, they think of them as small little cooperatives that can't scale and don't amount to much. And so I wanted to kind of use this opportunity to point out that the commons have a far more far-reaching promise and value than we might otherwise understand. And so I'll read you a kind of a quote from David, who wrote this afterward in this book. He said there's a deep gravitational pull that the idea of the commons exerts on the human spirit. We gravitate to the commons because it speaks to our need for fairness and inclusion. Something very old, yet also something very contemporary. Now I'll read you another quote from Jonathan Rao. He says, corporations spend upward of $300 billion a year to cajole us to buy what they sell. Why would they do that if we really needed their stuff? With the commons, incessant prodding isn't necessary. People use commons because they're genuinely useful to them, and for that reason alone. And so the commons is kind of what the thing that will frame it today, but I wanted to kind of put forth to you whether, in the Singapore context at least, that our understanding of the voluntary sector is largely through this philanthropic lens, which Colin calls the hegemony of the bureaucratic model, which is about scale and replication, it's about professionally and expert-driven services and centrally funded and controlled, whether philanthropy has displaced mutual aid, and whether some of that community initiative has been dampened because of it. So that's a question mark. And how can these two kind of different impulses work together? But these terms are somehow not familiar, so I'll kind of define it for you at first, and then the experts later can correct me if I'm wrong. So what is the commons? The commons is shared resources or wealth or assets that are co-governed by the community of users according to rules, norms, and principles of their own making, to some extent like that. And so to give you an illustration, for example, in last year's conference, actually, maybe something to bring home to the nonprofits here, many of you who are service providers, we had a conference on community circles, and Community Circles UK came and presented to us, and Martin Routledge, the head of development, spoke to us about what they did. So community circles are basically, you form volunteers, a circle of support around a person who receives that support, and you meet once a month, and it's highly facilitated and structured. They give ad hoc support, like, drive the kids to school, or even longer term plans, like you want to get a job, or you want to sing in a choir, etc. And so what they did was they made all this. When I first found out the concept, I wanted to figure out, can we do it here? And so I went to their website and I figured, oh wow, there are all these do-it-yourself videos and manuals And then we got interested and we got money and we're going to start a pilot here in Singapore. And we even budgeted money to, maybe to pay them consultants fees so that they can teach us how to do it here. But having looked at their website and everything, I realized, hey, wow, they've made everything so accessible and so easy to understand that anybody can take that and run with it. And he said, we've been doing this, and in his own words, it's a really bad business model. And that kind of stuck with me. It's a really bad business model, but it's such a good social model, right? It's such because he's kind of basically sharing his knowledge instead of trying to enclose it. Instead of saying, we should train our facilitators, and the only people who can run this program should be people that come from us, and we should license or certify or credit these facilitators. No, they've just kind of made it easily accessible. So that stuck with me, and that's kind of, and in a sense, maybe I've saboted you guys a bit. So sabot is short for I guess, short for sabotage. I had a chat with our Tote Board friends. I say, that's such a really good example, and what is the role of funders in encouraging nonprofits who often see each other as competitors to share, to contribute to the knowledge commons and share one another? And I said, why don't, for whatever grants that you give, you insist that all of these nonprofit service providers create a do-it-yourself kit so that anybody can run with it. And they said, yeah, that's such a good idea. So what I'll do now is I'll introduce our guests. David Bollier, he's the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. You can read his bio yourself, but I wanted to point out that he's been writing about the commons for a really long time. In fact, he's working on a book right now, I understand. His most recent book in 2021 is The Commoners Catalog for Change Making. And true to the spirit of the commons, you can go to that website and you can basically read the book of it. In 2019, he published Free, Fair and Alive, The Insurgent Power of the Commons. That's in our National Library, you can borrow it. In 2015, there's Patterns of Commoning. That's also online, and I've been clicking on it to look at all the examples of commoning. It's really good, and he's had a lot more. Will Ruddick is the founder of Grassroots Economics, and he's probably the smartest guy in this room, right? He did computer programming and he's 15 years old. I paid for his PhD in physics. He's applied physics to economics. And I watched his YouTube documentary on creating a community currency called Bangla Pesa in Mombasa in Kenya. And the one thing that stuck with me was he did this kind of simulation of the market and say these are all the merchants and vendors, and this is the amount of natural inequality that happens there, and that's good inequality. That's normal, right? Some people have better potatoes and some people have stuff that others don't really want. But then you introduce the ability for some of these vendors or merchants to become banks, so allow them to make loans, and then suddenly you do the simulation and wow, the inequality is it's become very obvious and trade goes down. So that always stuck with me, and we want to hear from him then how a secondary currency or complementary currency can be a vehicle for addressing economic inequality. And so without further ado, can I invite David to share with us about the commons?
Well, thank you, Justin, thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here and share some sort of a larger overview with more specifics about the commons. I have some slides to help me illustrate that, so let me just share my screen really quickly. Okay. I want to talk about how we create and protect commons in a world that's basically dominated by the market state system. A lot of people say the market and the state are different, and of course they do have different responsibilities and authority and powers, but it's also true that they share the same vision of economic progress and growth and technological innovation and consumerism. And the commons walks in a different path, and I want to explain that. So let me just move my slides here. So I want to talk about how the commons can help us imagine some new pathways for growing a new type of world. And I want to stress that the commons is a distinct social form and paradigm. It's not just this amorphous sharing and caring, important as those are to the commons. But we also a lot of times get stuck on the ideological debates about, well, should we have capitalism? Should we have socialism, or maybe communism? And all of these are very state-focused approaches to the question of how to meet needs. Now, obviously, the state is very important, but I want to suggest that the commons has a different center of gravity. It's a more bottom-up, socially grounded place of power and moral authority and getting things done. So one reason, though, that the commons is also misunderstood is because the market and state are seen as the only effective or dominant forces for governance or for making things for us, that the commons sort of drifts off and is regarded as this archaic artifact of English or British history that really doesn't have much relevance for our times. And so a lot of people find it invisible, or they misunderstand what it's really about. And part of this has happened because of the now famous so-called tragedy of the commons essay that Garrett Hardin, a biologist, wrote in 1968 in the Science Journal. And he, in a famous account, said, imagine you have a pasture in which everyone can graze as much as they want. Nobody will have an individual reason or rationale for holding back, and so they will overexploit the shared resource and ruin it. This being called the tragedy of the commons. Now, this is a deceptive story that has become a truism within economics and political circles, that shared wealth cannot be successfully managed. But in fact, there's a lot of hidden assumptions within that parable. Lewis Hyde, one historian of the commons, said it's really the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. In other words, a lot of the premises of free market economics itself, that without regard to their neighbors or community or the future, they won't negotiate or communicate with each other to figure out how to manage it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of built-in premises to that story which are simply not empirically true. And it took Professor Eleanor Ostrom, who was a political scientist at Indiana University, her life work was doing empirical work, especially in the global South and natural resource-based commons, to show that people can manage their forests, their fisheries, their farmland, their irrigation water, their wild game without overexploiting it. And her book, Governing the Commons, was one of her major books. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work, showing that cooperation can actually work and be economically consequential. And this was sort of a radical idea for standard economics. But so she laid the groundwork for theoretically and empirically for showing that commons can be entirely sustainable if they meet certain design conditions. And she issued a famous list of 8 design conditions, some of which are incorporated into what I'll be talking about in a moment. But it's important to stress that a commons is not just a resource. It's a self-organized social system that consists of a community that decides it wants to manage some sort of wealth as a group. It consists of resource, although that term resource is kind of a loaded term as well, because it implies that you could just turn it into a commodity and sell it, which is not always true. And the social norms and practices and traditions and rules that a community establishes for managing that resource in a sustainable way. So it's important to make this distinction to say that it's not just oceans or the internet or the atmosphere that is a commons. No, that's a common pool resource that is in need of commons governance, but by itself, it's not a commons. I hope some of my examples will help elaborate on this point. Now, what matters in a commons is relationality, how we relate to each other socially, ethically, what understandings we come to with each other. And if you put the relationality at the center of the commons, it opens up new vistas of possibility, because you understand this is a socially constructed system for producing stuff and governing stuff governing ourselves in a fair way, and having relationships with the earth, which is something that the story of Homo economicus, the rational utility maximizing individual of standard economics, it's something that concept doesn't encompass, the relationality of how we connect to each other in very deeply interdependent ways. And so I just want to stress this point by citing this great quote from Thomas Berry, who is a cultural historian, where he says, "The universe is the communion of subjects, not a collection of objects." Standard economics likes to think that, everything is a collection of objects that we transact and trade with. But in fact, geologically, biologically, in an evolutionary sense, we are all subjects. And the commons really partakes of that deeper ontological worldview. Or as another eco-philosopher puts it, science and economics are unwilling to acknowledge creative aliveness as an ontological foundation of reality. That too is a concept that's at the center of the commons, that we are living agents that have creative, adaptive roles to play in how we manage things. So this is very different from simply supply and demand and bartering and trading in markets. So we start to get into this realm of what I call symbiotic relations and cooperation, where we have these ongoing, mutually supportive but different roles we play with each other within a commons or even beyond the commons. And this creates value. It may not be put in property rights, it may not be monetized or traded in financial ways, but it creates value that's very important to us, whether it's ecological, the fruits of nature, or care work that we give to each other, or gift economies that we see in academic disciplines, or many other ways where living organisms or humans get together and create value without necessarily using money or trade to do it. So this is a very different worldview and ethos and operational logic than capitalist modernity, you might say. So it has some very deeply different ways of approaching the world and how value is created. And one way of thinking about this is how the iceberg that the Community Economies Research Network has created, where they show that wage labor and commodity markets and capitalist enterprise is really just the tip of the iceberg. And there's huge realms of everyday life that are not mediated by markets, which are creating lots of value. Some of these are not necessarily commons because they may not have the stability and continuity and stewardship. Nonetheless, there's lots of non-market stuff going on that creates value. Now, I want to give a brief tour of the commons verse, as I call it, so that you have a better idea of some examples of the types of commons that are in contemporary life. They may not be necessarily named as a common, and many people who are actually commoning, meaning engaging in the coordination and negotiation to manage their shared wealth, they may not even use the language of the commons, but they very often are doing it. And one point of talking about the commons is to make it more culturally visible so that we can start to grapple with it, name it, give it more theoretical depth, so that we can grow it and expand it. It helps to understand that the commons is actually quite old. I think it's as old as humanity, because traditional and indigenous commons have been around for millennia. And in fact, it's been estimated that there's about 2 billion subsistence commoners around the world who are managing different types of natural resources as commons for their everyday sustenance. Sometimes this is denigrated as mere subsistence. And in fact, some people are, quote, poor, but really what it means is that it's for household use and not necessarily for market use, or the market trade is more limited and not the primary objective. And this is really important for these times of climate change, because commons are, for the most part, a more stable, ecologically benign way of provisioning. They don't require the extraction, the endless growth that capitalist economics requires. Now, this is not just in the global south that this is happening. In Europe, North America, the West, there's a lot of local food movements to try to relocalize food production and supply chains. And these are just some of the examples of where this is happening with agroecology and permaculture. Community-supported agriculture is surging these days in Europe and North America. And there's other movements like slow food, and there's many more I could cite, but I just want to say that this is a robust area of development these days, especially as supply chains get more problematic and volatile and costly and carbon intensive. The city as a commons is growing. There's a lot of, especially in Europe, cities like Amsterdam, Barcelona, Bologna, a lot of French and Italian cities are exploring how citizens can self-organize different projects to take greater control over their lives in cities, whether it's spaces or elder care or Wi-Fi systems or information systems or data, how they can take control of it and not simply be government driven and controlled. Maybe the government helps providing infrastructure or legal support or finance, but these are bottom-up efforts to reclaim the city and not just be bureaucratically administered things. So it's a very robust area. The coast cities movement is often associated with this, and they do a lot of work on it, which is based at a number of universities around the world. Alternative currencies, as we'll hear more from Will Ruddock in a few minutes, they are an extremely important way for communities to capture more of the value they create and not have it siphoned away by the major financial centers. So in other words, a community can recirculate value through its currencies and make itself more self-sufficient and resilient. I work with the Schumacher Center for New Economics. They've been pioneers in the Berkshire's currency, and in fact recently launched a smartphone digital version of Berkshire's, which can only be traded in the region of Western Massachusetts. So it's really a grand experiment for taking regional currencies to a whole different level. The web is a hosting infrastructure for commons. We usually associate it with social media like Facebook or Twitter and so forth, but those are simply the corporate versions of trying to capture our propensity to share and cooperate. The truth is that the web has very low barriers for people to self-organize and collaborate, as you see with things like Wikipedia, which now has tens of thousands of participants in one form or another, and it works in dozens of different languages. And the beauty of the web is that commoning can meet a lot of needs quite quickly without too much external bureaucracy or even with too much money, although money often helps a great deal. And I will mention a few of the kinds of robust commons on the web. The open source software explosion has been part of this. These are the logos of some of the more prominent software systems. The Linux is represented by the Penguin. There's LibreOffice, which is an open source shareable word processing program. Then there's a lot of server software represented by that Feather. Apache is a major server software. So there's a lot of these different systems which are indispensable to the internet that have been created by voluntary communities of hackers and programmers to make better software. And it often rivals or exceeds proprietary software created by major software companies. Another important factor in growing commons on the internet have been so-called Creative Commons licenses. If you're a copyright holder, you can use one of these publicly available free licenses to signal to anyone that they can use your work for free without permission or payment if you meet certain conditions. There's a number of different choices you can make. For example, attribution or non-commercial. Some people don't want their work commercialized. Others, there might be no derivative. If you're a photographer, you can specify no derivative works. You have to have the exact photo, and so forth. These licenses have allowed the proliferation of shareable content legally online, which was previously very difficult or costly. You basically had to have an attorney. And so this has been important legal infrastructure for sharing online in a legal fashion. I can't overstate its importance in growing shareable commons online. And then there's even further generations of sharing online, such as cosmo-local production, where you have design and knowledge that's being shared in an open source fashion among global communities, but there's actual physical production of things like agricultural equipment that FarmHack is doing. There's actually a number of projects that create open source motor vehicles. Arduino is a set of electronic circuit boards that have been created that they're trademarked and you can buy them, but they're also, you can use the designs for free. They're not proprietary. And Fab Labs are one vehicle for helping to foster this kind of sharing among people in a non-proprietary way. There's no master inventory of commons. They can arise anywhere. And that's something important to stress, because any type of community can get together and say, we want this to be a commons. In Boston, in the United States, there's something called the HowlRound Theater Commons that has helped bring together all sorts of non-commercial and community and ethnic theater companies and playwrights and producers and so forth. It's been a fabulous way for them to create value outside of the Hollywood, New York, Broadway, the shadow of that world. There's the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team that creates street maps or natural landscape maps when there's an emergency or earthquake, so that responders can know where the hospitals and the water and other emergency resources are. It's a fantastic sort of spontaneous coordination effort that occurs after emergencies. There's a potato park in Peru where a number of different indigenous peoples manage the most diverse array of potato species or types of potatoes in the world. And they are the stewards of it, preventing the potatoes and the genetic information from being patented or appropriated by multinational companies. Very important. In the same vein, the Open Source Seed Initiative is trying to assure that seeds can be shared and you can breed them in new ways, as opposed to being controlled by copyright or patent law or contracts from the major biotech companies. And in Catalonia, you actually have a major regional Wi-Fi system that's managed as a commons, helping provide excellent quality internet access without all the high expenses and low quality that you often get from corporate providers. So that's sort of just a quick overview of some of the major sectors of it. I recently released this book called The Commoner's Catalog for Change-Making: Tools for the Transitions Ahead, which is it's based on the Whole Earth catalog, for those of you who might remember in the late 60s or 1970s, in which it provides sort of short accounts of different interesting things with resources for chasing down the websites, the books, the organizations, or other projects that are advancing these different types of commons. It was my attempt to try to make this information about the commons in its broadest scope more popularly accessible to people in a readable fashion, so that my mother could understand it. But I should get to the point of, how does this all relate to nonprofits? Is a nonprofit a commons? Well, it could be, but it's not necessarily. It's important to understand that commons are about the social practice and peer governance, often known as commoning. It's not defined by the legal or organizational formalities. I know of important federation of housing commons where people manage their own apartment complexes and own them, which is run as a limited liability partnership. So the point is that the law doesn't necessarily dictate how you can run, whether you can govern it as a commons. Certainly cooperatives and perhaps for benefit companies or other structures are more predisposed to support commenting. One of the problems actually is that the law often is silent or hostile to commons because it's so market oriented, so focused on individual rights, so focused on market contracts and market economic concerns, that it often doesn't have the legal sanction or chartering for commons that we need. That's another topic, but the legal hacks and innovation we need to make commenting work. I tried to identify and elaborate on the different social patterns of commenting in this book that I released in 2019 with my co-author Silke Helfrich, who was a German activist and scholar there. We had worked together on a number of projects, including some book anthologies about commons. But in this book, we wanted to describe what we call patterns of commenting, which we take this methodology from Christopher Alexander, who was he died only just a few months ago. He was kind of a dissenting urban planner and architect who saw that there were certain recurrent problems with certain patterns of solutions. And he developed what he called a pattern language, which is this lattice work of similar solutions to recurrent problems. And the point is that these social answers emerge over time. There's not like this universal answer or universal philosophy. It's something that people improvise and create, and over time, certain things are fixed on as the better solutions. So we applied, that's some of the patterns he developed for urban spaces, or he identified for urban spaces. So we wanted to do this for commenting, and based on looking at dozens of different commons that we had encountered over the years, identified some of these patterns that emerge in three interrelated areas: the social life of the commons, the provisioning, the way people produce things to meet needs, and the peer governance, how they manage disputes, how they set rules, how they punish people who transgress the rules or take too much or ruin things. And I don't want to go through, or don't have time and don't want to go through all these patterns, but I just want to suggest that there are certain touchstones or recurrent ways that most commons function socially and through governance, irrespective of the resource. Of course, resources that can be used up, like water or land or forest, there are certain rules that have to apply to them versus, say, software code, which is infinite and can be cheaply reproduced. But what I'm talking about is the social organization horizontally among the people tend to have these patterns. It's not necessarily all of them, but they tend to have these patterns. And I'll just cite a few of these patterns to give you an idea of what they sound like, what they mean. For example, in any commons, you have to bring diversity of perspectives and talents into shared purpose, shared focus. And you need to have commoners' consent in the decision-making, if not their active participation. How you structure that, there's many ways, and you need to develop a sphere of trust so that people share even embarrassing stuff, not to score points or to gain power, but so you can have an honest reckoning with the situation on the ground. And similarly, you need to share knowledge generously the way you do in an open source context, and so on. I will just signal, for example, the dealings with money and markets is an especially problematic or difficult, tricky area, because money and markets can often colonize and take over a commons and destroy its integrity and its ability for people to work together. So that's one reason a pattern is keep commons and commerce distinct. Not that you can't engage with the marketplace, but you just have to be careful that the marketplace norms don't take over your commons. So the upshot of all this is that there's a different framework for creating value than markets, and price is not the only arbiter of it. And these are some of the values that are represented in this framework, such as peer governance and fairness. You have responsibilities linked to entitlements. You meet basic needs first. Shared wealth. You have shared wealth that you're managing that isn't for sale. It's for the benefit of the members of a commons, and you're thinking long term to steward it, not long-term exploitation or bottom lines. And a lot of this is the moral, ethical gyroscope is custom and tradition that helps keep it on track over time. Now, it's important to understand that the commons is not this ideology. It's really about bottom-up practical experimentation and what works. And over time, people come to find what works, not just in a general sense, but in their particular geography, with that particular culture, in that particular political climate. And this helps liberate people to craft things that are well suited and hardy for their particular context. It helps to remember the line by the historian Peter Linebaugh, there is no commons without commoning. It's really, commons is really better thought of as a verb, a process, than a thing. And this helps underscore that idea. Finally, I think it helps to understand that we need to bend our vocabulary a bit to understand the commons better. I mentioned earlier how the word resource I sometimes choke on because it implies that the resource, whether it's a fishery or forest, is other, different from humanity. But in fact, I might have a long relationship with those resources, and therefore I prefer to call it care wealth. So because I have a different relationship to it, it's part of my culture or maybe even my identity. Similarly, I'm not necessarily this isolated individual. I'm a nested I. I'm nested within larger collectives that help shape me, even though I retain my individuality. And we invented the term Ubuntu rationality because that's a term from South Africa, from indigenous people, which it translates roughly as I am because we are. And it's about aligning our individual interests with our collective interests. And that's what's rational. It's not just rational to take as much as you can and destroy the environment, the way economics sometimes regards that as rational, and so on. So I'm a big fan of trying to develop some of these different languages to help us understand commons better. What it all adds up to is that this helps create, through horizontal federations of commoning, a politics of belonging, an economics of sufficiency where we can have enough, we can have our needs met, we don't have this endless cycle of more material production and more consumption. And it's about finding ways to decommodify wealth so that it can be shared more broadly. And I think there's lots of positive externalities, as an economist might say, from this type of culture. Taken together, the commonsverse really represents a resilient parallel economy that sometimes intersects, sometimes competes with the market state system, both because it can do so more efficiently or in more trustworthy, satisfactory, stable ways, or because the market strikes back and gets very worried that the commons is a competitor, the way Microsoft did when open source software first arrived and was saying, oh, open source software is communism and so forth, before they found a way to co-opt some of the open source world. But some of the attributes of this parallel economy is it has a richer collective wisdom because it's based on sharing. Power is distributed. It's not as centralized as you tend to see in corporations and the state. And there's these dense social relationships and ecological relationships. And because these relationships are about flows of information, you have these trustworthy feedback loops that help you adapt and be more resilient over time. I haven't gotten too much into the topic of enclosure. Enclosure is the privatization and marketization of shared wealth. Any commons has to have legal or technological or social ways to prevent its shared wealth from being enclosed. So that's an important concern that we could talk about. And finally, there's a lot of long-term holistic value that's created. It's not just private, individual, or material wealth. It's richer. I will conclude by saying that, some people say, well, how can commons scale? They're too small, they're too trivial, they're too local. I think the point is not to create some mega organization of commons or consolidated bureaucracy of it. It's about emulating and federating the different commons the way we already see in the digital world. So that the point is the next big thing will be a lot of small things that are brought together and loosely coordinate with each other to meet needs in their very particular circumstances. So that's my presentation. These are some of the books that I've written in the past 10 years. The ones on the right are all available online for free. If you do a search for their titles, you'll find the websites dedicated to them, and you can read them online, or of course, you can buy them in print as well. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to further conversation about this later in the program.
Thank you so much, David. I have so many questions, which I will reserve for later, but I really like the last quote about how the next big thing will be a lot of small things. And we have actually invited Rob Hopkins, the kind of founder of Transition Towns, for one of our learning journeys later on. You can sign up for that. And it's a similar message, right? It's Transitions Town, in his terms, is a local response to very big global problems. But for now, we would like to invite Will Reddick to come share with us on community currencies and local exchange trade systems. Over to you, Will.
Hi, Justin, and thanks for having me, guys, and really, really great to be here. Just to double check, is my audio choppy or is it okay?
It's good.
Okay, good. I just wanted to say thanks to David. This is one of the few books I actually have in Kenya that's in a physical copy, so really enjoyed it. So much appreciated around that. So,
thank you, Will. I've come close to seeing you in a couple times. I'm glad to at least see you on the screen now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a lot of the work that we've done over the years has, been focused around commons and talking about commons in different ways, and really sort of trying to focus on the economic aspects of it, which are sometimes, avoided for good reason. I'm gonna step you through a process here and share screen here. Let me just get to it here. There we go. All right. Hope everybody can see that. So I'm going to talk about community inclusion currencies. We've been working as a nonprofit foundation here in Kenya for almost 12 years, kind of iterating on these concepts of community currencies and different types of economic commons or service commons. This is a group of women in near Lake Victoria, and this was, during kind of peak COVID, and their entire markets had really shut down. There was literally all the cash that was sort of coming in from, Nairobi and the main cities had stopped, and it basically was like the lubrication for their automobile, like, having no oil, and their markets completely stopped. And so what we worked with them to do was to create a commons around the services and goods and services they all provide each other, to see it that way, to see their own abundance, and denominate that commons in the form of a credit obligation, a voucher, redeemable as payment for their goods and services. So they created a circulating voucher and revived their local economic system, and it created a lot of resilience for them. And we've been doing different versions of this for years, and I'll kind of go into some of the details around it. But David mentioned a few of these points, and I really wanted to. I made this slide just to sort of really point out that we still live in a very imperialistic system. The monetary system that we have today was designed in many, many ways in order to trap a population into subserviency. And I mean, in Kenya today, you can look at the history of the British coming in. for instance, and forcing people into hut taxes with a currency. So every person in Kenya holding a house had to start paying a fee every month to the British in a currency that they had no control over, no rights, nothing. And only, you know, the sovereign, the queen could, you know, mint those currencies and whatnot. So this idea of monetary imperialism was extremely strong, and it came even before that with the Romans, and, you know, where did the British learn it from? And so there's a very long history of using a monetary system to control people. And so this is kind of, you know, just in brief, I'll just read these. The recipe for monetary imperialism. So introducing a currency that only an elite control, enabling people to buy drugs like tea and sugar with it. This was a big thing in the colonies, right? Really get people addicted to your imports, right? Or things that are being processed by you. Specifically drugs was a big way to get people to really need these things. Force people to start paying taxes with it, as I just mentioned. Outlaw or restrict other forms of currency or reciprocity, right? So there were many, you know, probably we don't even know the full history of all the indigenous forms of reciprocal systems. You know, there was the chief's gourd and the calabash. There was different forms of tally sticks. Some of our oldest history is actually from here where I am in Kenya, where we have bones that have been notched to denote reciprocity within communities. Specifically supporting processed and foods and cash crops, right? So you're growing food not for yourself anymore. You're growing food to get money so that you can buy tea and sugar or other foods that you need. And then enshrining individual property ownership and rent seeking, right? Basically telling the whole world right now, you know, some people like Chris Cook would say that we're at peak rent, you know, like it's okay to own a high rise in Hong Kong and have thousands of families for generations having to pay rent to you, and with no end in sight. Those people will never have a path to own their own home in the current situation. So, you know, the whole world being owned, you know, physically even, is kind of been enshrined. You know, this idea that, you know, private property is something enshrined in current system. So, you know, opposite of that, something that we're really trying to push towards is something we might call an economic commons or a service commons, in which case people co-develop currencies with mutual agreements. So we think about money in this case not as a commodity, which can be enclosed, like David was talking about. So instead of something like, you know, think of Donald Duck sitting on a mountain of gold coins as commodities, right, that can be collected. And you can think of Bitcoin like this as well, as a collectible object. Instead, if you think about money as mutual agreements, it has a very different form. And actually, there's a lot of history around mutual agreements, like split tally sticks, all kinds of different, you know, like nautical contracts and things like this. And we'll get more into those kinds of instruments. We want to ensure people can buy goods or services with them, right? So this is a little bit talking about the supply. Like if there is a supply of credit, if we're talking about credit theory of money, well, a credit obligation needs to be backed by real things, real goods and services. So, you know, if we look at sort of the derivative market of all these financial instruments that are sort of built on a deck of cards, what's actually at the bottom of them we find in our current society? Often nothing. It's money being printed with no basis, and the same with a lot of cryptocurrency. Enable contractual and transparent, equitable taxation. So basically, are there forms of maintenance of the commons that can be voted on transparently? Can there be forms of taxation? We'll talk a little bit about demurrage and Gessel taxing, or Gessel taxes, enshrining the rights and obligations to create currency. So this is a big thing. You know, if we believe that money itself is credit, if we think about the credit theory of money in this way, then it's about trust. And if I trust David and I give him a book and I expect him to return that book, well, we've created credit in that instance. And that should be a human right, right? We need the ability to trust each other. And that's what monetary imperialism really destroyed in a lot of villages and a lot, you know, huge parts of the world. They said, you can no longer trust yourselves. You can no longer create your own reciprocity mechanisms. You have to use ours. So that's it's such a strong belief that we have right now, is that we can't build trust, we can't create commons, because we need the currency of our masters, right? We need, and really the nation states just took this over. They took over the role completely, where a few tribes or a few elite people began to run the same exact program that the imperialists ran before them, right? Supporting local food production and soil regeneration. We'll get into some techniques that we use here that are really exciting, called syntropic agroforestry, and enshrining group land ownership and production sharing agreements. And so this is, again, getting right into the comments. So this community inclusion currencies, vouchers or credit obligations redeemable for community goods and services. I mean, this form of money, as stamp script or different types of script, has a super long history. I mean, it probably is the original form of money that you might have seen. Like if it was paper money, that would have been on the Silk Road. With the first people who were actually creating paper notes were merchants that were creating, essentially invoices that could be tradable, right? So if I buy a bunch of apples from David and I say, return those apples to me in a month, I might be able to sell that contract to someone else, right? And that can act as a currency. And we'll get into other forms of that now, but most of you are probably familiar with airtime credit, right? Most telecoms issue a credit redeemable for the service of communication. That is what we might call a producer credit rather than a mutual credit. Anyways, when I was getting into this is sort of my history of study in this was, back in around 2000, going from a PhD in physics into economics, and getting very excited when I read Bernard Leotar's book on the future of money. And I was also studying Forex exchange and hedge funds at the time. And I read about Banco Las Palmas and a lot of these programs in Japan as well, and Berkshires, for instance. And I got really excited and passionate, and I thought, well, maybe these programs, could work a lot better in places where people were really having a huge gap in a medium of exchange, right? So not that they couldn't work anywhere, but just, I was looking at how they were working in a lot of, states in the US and whatnot. And the gap to fill, that was sort of absent, I could see in places like Kenya would be much more larger. So I joined the Peace Corps as a volunteer, and then learned Swahili, and have been here since about 2008. This is the organization that I started, called Grassroots Economics. This is our team here in Kenya. There's also a few programmers missing here as well, but we've got a great team. It's lovely to work here and with the communities here. And I think that when people see these programs working, they want to spread them. Like, most of we've got about 60,000 households using these in Kenya now, and most of that is word of mouth. We don't really do much advertising or anything like that, and it's a village group going and training the next village group. Just to give you an idea of sort of the structure of a community inclusion currency, this structure, I work a lot with Chris Cook, who talks about like kind of the history of monetary systems and credit systems. And these kind of three parts here are sort of axiomatic, or, kind of a trifecta that sort of define what is credit in general. Like, how do we create trusted credit instruments to trade with each other? And so first off, there's the idea of the service providers. Now, in history, you might have called this the treasury. This could be your value. Like, what is the actual value being traded among people? Secondly, you would have, in history, this would be called here a mint, the witness or validation. This would be like the stamp of the queen on the coin if you're creating coinage, right? So someone is validating, and this could be validation through other mechanisms. There's peer-to-peer validation mechanisms. There's all kinds of potential validation mechanisms, but they're important. If you have value, you need some sort of validation of that value if it's going to be used in a credit sense. And then you have a ledger. So what people are doing is they're taking their services as a group. They're saying we provide X, Y, and Z services. Let's say as a group of businesses. It could also be done by an individual business. And you end up with different structures when you have groups of currencies rather than groups creating a currency. But it's something interesting we can talk about later. But essentially what they're doing is they're creating a voucher, a legal credit obligation. And we do use rule of law. We create legal contracts, and these are contracts between individuals. So under contract law, I can create an invoice with David, that says what he has to, what's both sides of that contract. What's the mutual win and mutual risk for both of us? If that contract fails, we can define mediation around that. That's another service that can be in here as well. And those contracts are put onto a ledger. And in the old days, like in UK or Britain, this would be like the exchequer. This would be like the guy with a checkered table that's recording all these things, going on. So this would be your treasury, your mint, and your exchequer, creating kind of these functions in a way of governance that states used. But also, if you go into old villages and things like this, if you look at the structures of reciprocity, these three things kind of had to exist in general for different types of reciprocal systems. There has to be a memory, right? There has to be some sort of actual service or value, and there has to be some sort of witness or validation process around those things. This is a visualization here of, I think it was January through 2020 through 2021. Thomas Fleischman made this just using the anonymous transaction history. So, I mean, back to this, we do use the distributed ledgers we use. We can kind of get more into that. I'm an advocate of distributed ledgers, not necessarily decentralized ledgers, as you see in a lot of the blockchain world. I think that's a buzzword that we need to sort of start avoiding a little bit, to be honest about it. But I think that, the distribution of the ledger such that the witness or the judge or whoever's holding it can't alter it is very important. And also that it's publicly accessible. Ledgers, a publicly accessible ledger is very valuable for many, many reasons. I don't believe these instruments that are being stored on this ledger are not your traditional crypto. They are stable utility vouchers backed by specific goods and services, right? Or baskets of goods and services. So just to sort of differentiate the crypto world, you can still store legal credit obligations on a blockchain and use that blockchain as a shared ledger without a lot of the crypto element. And by crypto element, I just mean printing a lot of excess, trillions of tokens backed by nothing is a lot of what we see there, and a lot of not well built instruments. So this is just some stats. So we've seen about $3 million worth of trade that January 2020 to 2021. We did a randomized controlled trial, and we saw 5 times the local trade within a 2-month period of implementation. And we've got a lot of measurable impact. So one thing as well that a transparent and immutable ledger has given us the ability is to publish anonymized trade data and have studies on that. So we have in UK data archives, you can actually download that transaction history and actually get a sense of what these networks are looking like. This is just to show you how we connect people in a village to a blockchain. And what we did was we basically worked with the local telecoms. We have a server sitting there at the telecom. This is to create an account on a public ledger. And note that we created our own humanitarian blockchain that doesn't charge any sort of gas fees or anything. It's very cheap to run. So we're trying to get away from the whole kind of rent-seeking aspect of the crypto world as well. Basically, that server connects people from their USSD phones into that public ledger. They basically have an account that's locked to a PIN and their SIM card. To send a voucher, they can store many vouchers in their account. They can have essentially thousands. I mean, there's really very little limit on that. So you could have many different village tokens or vouchers that represent different communities and different commons. They can be tradable with each other, and just to send to someone right now, you simply just would put their phone number in, you put the amount, you put your password, you both get a receipt. It's very, very simple. And it's also, people are used to using, Kenya's a bit special because people are used to using this sort of text-based trading systems. We have a digital version of this coming out hopefully midway through this year in July. So like being able to use something like this in Singapore in different ways. And it's all a totally copyleft open source code, so you can, reproduce it yourself. Resource mapping and mapping your own abundance. This is sort of getting into like, now how do we go into a community and develop one of these? So we have like networks of trainers and communities that go and train other communities of trainers. We also train humanitarian actors like the Red Cross and World Food Program on how to implement these programs themselves. So right now we're actually working in Cameroon with GIZ and ICRC and the Red Cross there on doing this. And so they're going out to communities and they're basically doing a lot of exercises like this. This is an exercise you might see in a time bank where people are basically, you have a ball of thread, someone holds it and they throw it to someone that they have a strong connection to or a need, where they're actually offering a service to that person, or that person offers a service to them. That person catches the ball of string and throws it to the next person and the next person. And it's just really just over and over again, mapping out what are the daily needs and offers and wants of your community, mapping your care, support, emotional needs and offers, really just again and again. It's so important to visualize that with your community. I think, in some ways, the communities here that are cash poor, in some ways are very rich in their connections to each other. While as, in a suburb in America, everyone goes to Costco for all their needs, and any of the other needs they have, they pretend they don't have them. And you know what I mean? Like, so I think there's a lot of abundance in communities here. That's really beautiful. Yeah, how do you help others? How do you help each other? And what offerings are also like, what are the gaps? What's missing in that network? What can be found locally and non-locally? And really to identify what are those non-local things, what, and do we need them? How do we bring them into the network? How do we do things like import replacement? And not that everything, we're not trying to create like ultimately like 100% self-sufficient isolated communities. We do want to have connections between communities. So if the neighboring community is doing sugarcane, well, this community doesn't have to be farming as much sugarcane, for instance, and things like that. We do a lot of practical role play systems. So we'll use beans, for instance, as a currency. So everyone in the group will get something like 100 beans, or actually even just 10 beans. And we'll say, okay, each one of these beans is worth 1 egg. And the market value of an egg is about 10 shillings. So you say, okay, great. Each bean is going to have a market value of 10 shillings right now. And we're going to trade. And so like people might have little cards that say boda boda, like a motorcycle transport. And we just get them to simulate a local market with 10 beans. And just see what happens. And so we do this role play. They create an inventory. They receive their beans. They have a market time. They introduce what they sell. They buy and sell. And at the end of it, what we do is we have everyone sit down and we count now. How many beans do you have? And so everyone's counting these beans. And this is sort of an example of this. In fact, there's a link somewhere here. This is like, sometimes I'll do this interactively online where we have a group of people trading. So we say, okay, here's your community. Okay, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people that also have a collective project as well. And what they're going to do is they're going to create a voucher, a credit obligation, redeemable for their goods and services. And while they're different colors right here, they could all be the same color. I just wanted to differentiate them for this purposes, but they could create one voucher as the whole group. So, and everyone gets some of these vouchers, and it's backed by their fish. So Roy has, he's committed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fish worth 20 shillings each. And so he's creating a credit of 100 vouchers. we could talk about this as a credit limit. If you were in a time bank or some of these other like a Let's program, you would say he'd start at a trade balance of 0 and have a credit. He can go negative 100. But again, we can talk about different systems for community currencies a little bit later. But essentially, he's been given a credit by the group, and there's the process to do so. Basically involves kind of an audit of his shop. It has, you know, local authorities like the elders will come in, and even the chief will say that yes, you know, this is proper, because they're going to mediate disputes as well. So dispute mediation for this as a commons is really important. So each person here has gotten some vouchers, and he's able to now say, okay, I'm gonna take 10 of mine. I'm gonna give them to Pia. I'm gonna get some water. Great. Pia could take that same voucher or any of her vouchers and say, okay, I want to buy some seeds from Shyla. I need some seeds over here. They could also designate a set of vouchers for a community project that could be managed by them locally as well. So this would be like a community garden. We do a lot of this syntropic agroforestry, and they could spend that on Shyla's labor, right? So this is a really, or her seeds in this case, but this is really important in terms of thinking about how to bootstrap community projects. Can I create a credit against the future production of this farm, right? In a way, this is going back to like almost like a futures contract or a bond, right? You're creating a bond that's redeemable for the produce coming out of this, right? And so these people who are getting this money from the farm for their services, well, these people can come back later and buy some of those vegetables. Whoops. Here we go. And ideally more vegetables are being grown there, right? So there's mutual risk and reward going on with this, because this could break down. This could break down, like, you know, Willie's there's no more flour here. And what you're doing as a mutual credit in this case is you're de-risking the local credit system. Now, this is internal. This is the group trading amongst themselves, but you could also have external trade as well. And so if there's a person over here, or let's say over here, and Roy wants, you know, they want to do some work for Roy, and Roy says, well, I don't have money to pay you, but I'll pay you in some of our vouchers, right? Well, this person in a way is joining or investing into the utility of this community, right? So it's not an investment in equity in terms of voting or something like that on what is done in the community, but it could be, there could be voting rights attached to these as well, and we can get into that, which is exciting as well. But I think this is also really important. So a telecom, if this was one organization, oops, right, and they were creating a voucher like a telecom, or mileage plus miles if you're an airline, well, their whole motive would not necessarily be internal trade of these. They would be selling these to the Visa company or the banks that want to use them for loyalty points and things like that, right? Or if you're a telecom, they'd be selling these outward to the community. Or if you're a church, let's say this is all a big church. We had an example of this where a church wants to buy a water tank. They need shillings for the water tank, and and gutters, you know, to collect water into this water tank. And so what they do is they create a voucher redeemable for the water that will be in that water tank. And also, so that would be like the project here. And there's also redeemable for any of the members of the congregation. So it's de-risked just in case the water tank doesn't exist. And then people inside or outside could buy those vouchers, right? That raises the funds for the water tank. The water tank gets purchased, and then these people use it back for the water, right? So thinking about community currency is not just an internal thing, but also a way of how to interact with the rest of the world, how to fundraise, and how to create networks of community currencies is really important as well. So let me move on a little bit. So I think I'll skip over this, but just to know, in terms of, like, sometimes we talk about the legality of these programs, and actually the Kenyan government took us to jail when we first started these. I'm back in 2012, and we won because you can't really stop a woman from paying for her school fees in tomatoes, right? Like, if you negotiate a contract with the terms of purchase, and that term is a voucher or a good or service, there's few governments in the world that can stop that, right? And if they did try to actually stop that, well, then so many things would become illegal in that country. So I guarantee that vouchers exist anywhere you are. If it's a bus ticket, right, you're still buying a credit obligation. Whether or not now you can retransfer that bus ticket to someone else, maybe not. It depends on the organization issuing them and whether or not they'll let you do that. We want to really promote that concept that you should, as a business or group of business or a municipality, create vouchers redeemable for your services as a healthy form of credit, and let that credit circulate and build economies around it, and even let those different types of credit interact with each other through markets. So I want to talk about the humanitarian space because we work a lot with the humanitarian space, and there's kind of two major ways that we've interacted with the humanitarian space around these. So first off, well, even maybe prior to these two, just the fact that you go to a community, you introduce these programs, and 2 years later you see that there is 5x or 10x the amount of local trade going on. There's much more abundance. People are happier. People trust each other more. Like that data alone and just those impacts is just huge. And secondarily, like when aid organizations, they have kind of different modalities. Sometimes they'll want to go in and do like a what they call a cash transfer program. And in this case, what they're often doing is just dumping a bunch of currency and on a let's say a disaster site or a village that's not doing so well. And so what we're trying to get them to do is, instead of taking vouchers from other communities or creating their own, what they do is they'll come in and actually buy some of the vouchers from an established group. So they say, oh, let us take some of your vouchers and redistribute those to the people who are needing them around the community. So what they're doing is they're actually creating more capacity and liquidity in the community that they're taking the vouchers from, and then they're redistributing those to like internally displaced people around the area. So instead of doing a cash transfer, which is really an exogenous money injection, you're really trying to build the capacity of the local community to support the community around them. So, and that has much more long-term effects because you're actually creating a local economy at the same time. This is another way that happens, is where looking at the impact data and what's happening in those communities, they may capacity build businesses or cooperative businesses within the community. This is, I prefer this method a bit more, but this method also has worked quite well in different cases. So in this second case, what they're doing is they're going in and saying, okay, we're going to, as a humanitarian organization, we see that you're lacking the capacity for sewing. And so we're going to buy a bunch of sewing machines, or we're going to work with you, and we're going to help create a cooperative business. We're going to increase your capacity. And in doing so, we're going to increase, with you, we're going to increase the supply of your local credit, because the credit is backed by capacity. And we didn't get quite into that, but generally what we do is we do an assessment of a month to 3 months of sales capacity of the members of the community. And that's the initial amount of credit that is created with the community. And that's an audit process we do with the local elders and community. And so if they're increasing the capacity, then that means that there can be more of the community currency there that can then be redistributed, just like in the first one, like to needy people. We're working in refugee camps around Kenya as well. And so that's so far that's been successful, and we're also kind of replicating this in Cameroon. I just wanted to touch on syntropic agroforestry. I would say 90% of syntropic agroforestry to me is just teaching people to grow mulch on site, right? So instead of bringing in your manure and your composting off site and bringing that in, you're doing that on site and you're growing grass. And there's one grass in particular that's wonderful called Mombasa grass. It grows faster than Nipia or velveteer grass. And it's just basically you're growing that to collect atmospheric air. It's basically your irrigation system. And then you're also cutting it and you're laying it down as mulch, right? So there's no soil being exposed. There's a lot more to it than that, but I would say that's one of the biggest learnings. And just tying that into the community currency, it is labor. It's a labor intensive method. It does rebuild soil. It is an amazing method. It's basically like a capturing a lot of the permaculture designs into food farming, essentially. And it does take labor. And so how do we get 50 acres cultivated in this way? And how do we pull people from charcoal burning and all their other jobs that they're busy doing to do something like this? Well, if we can create a credit redeemable against the future services from that farm, as well as other local services that are available now, it is one way that we can pay for, not we, but the community can pay for the labor and bringing people off of other jobs to do collective work, right? So we need some sort of bootstrapping mechanism. So this is, back to the community farm we mentioned before. And that's been really successful. We've done about 50 different farms so far in Kenya, and hoping to really see that those practices picked up more, both on syntropic agroforestry and other types of community projects, but also just this way of bootstrapping the finances to start those types of projects, because you've got to pull resources somehow. There's inputs that are needed, there's labor needed to start these things. And if you don't have money, you don't have, the imperialistic cash that's circulating here, the shilling, then you're in trouble. So I'm going to stop there. I've got quite a few other slides we can talk about impact claims and things like this, but I'm going to save them for the question and answer period. But in the end, just as a last statement, just, the ability for this is a group of women with very simple mobile phones and even other recording tools that they use, for them to have a shared ledger, for them to validate each other, for them to express their value, right, and share it amongst each other and the rest of the world, is really beautiful and a sacred thing. And if we can imagine, this is a group of factory workers that is now creating a voucher for their services and selling that to the factory owner. Well, he's no longer their employee, he's their client, right? So changing these relationships and creating commons around this kind of economic approaches, I think it has been really beautiful, and it's definitely changed my life. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Will, for that whirlwind tour of what you've done. I kind of feel like you're 10 steps ahead of everybody here. And maybe I'll start off with, we'll have Q&A until about 11:30, and I'll start with, I guess maybe the nonprofits here are thinking more from a kind of a city and urban context. And they're wondering, we have low-income families here, and what's wrong with just giving them more financial assistance versus, the possibility of creating a community currency that can improve economic inclusion or social mobility? Maybe you can kind of bring home the point on what the difference might be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff that's going on with government nowadays. Like even like Italy is having tax credits, for instance, that can circulate within communities, and to look at taxation as a source of basic income, I think is a very natural thing to do. I want to make sure that the vouchers being created are backed by real things. And you're not just minting more and more on money and creating an inflationary process, and eventually that's going to collapse to some degree. So, looking at your currency system and saying, well, what is really behind it, and holding the authorities to the same standards that you would hold anyone, and the same with community groups. So I think both approaches can work. And so within these communities, and I didn't talk about it much, but we've actually built onto the smart contracts a form of demurrage, and the community votes on where that demurrage goes, right? So that demurrage, it's a Gessel tax, it's a holding tax. It's the opposite of a transaction tax, right? A transaction tax basically tells people not to spend, right? Versus a holding tax basically promotes, it's a tax on holding the utility of the community. You're holding a utility token, right? You're holding a share of the utility, and we're taxing that as it should be, because you are basically stagnating the circulation. If you want to stagnate the circulation, fine, but you're taxed on it. And that tax goes back to a community fund that people can vote on, and that can go toward basic income schemes. The government can also do this, right? So vouchers redeemable for government services, which is essentially what your currency should be, could do the same thing. So I feel like when we talk about basic income, we are still in funny money mode, where we're just like airdropping a collectible object on people rather than an actual agreement.
Thanks, Will. So, we'll open for questions now. If anybody would like to raise your hands, then I'll call on you, or you can also type your questions into the Zoom chat. And maybe I can start by asking David a question first. I was struck by how you noted that the commons is not an ideology, and in fact, you had previously mentioned that it's almost trans-ideological. that people from the left to the right of the political spectrum like it for different reasons. And I wonder if you might share a bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, because commons are really based at a community level, whether geographically or online, it's about getting things done practically. And so ideology, which is more focused on state power, is kind of not so important. Libertarians like the commons because it allows individual initiative, but conservatives, political conservatives like it because it entails community responsibility. Liberals or the left like it because it has limits on market exploitation or appropriation of things. And others on the left like it because of the social justice element. So it's really a trans ideological thing in which getting stuff done for mutual benefit is more important than abstract debates, which are often fueled by politicians or the struggle to achieve state power for oneself, which is really a secondary issue for commoners who don't play that game and maybe are seen as marginal, but are getting a lot of stuff done without the, let's just say the difficulties and corruptions and degradation of public life that so much politics does entail.
I have a question from Benjamin Tan from Caring Fleet, and I suppose this is directed to Will. So part of it is you would need the government to support this initiative, I'm assuming community currency, if it is to accept it in a wider scale. How do you guarantee a service to the user unless you have a larger pool of people who can offer? So I suppose, Will, would you have a response? Do you actually need the government for this? No, right?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so there's two parts of that. One is around the government, and one is like how to provide sort of larger scale connections and liquidity in these types of systems. And if first you really start from the perspective of this is a utility voucher redeemable for your goods and service. Let's say you're an individual business, you're not even in a community group, and you're creating a airtime credit as a telecom or a voucher for your shop. For you to sell those or spend them into circulation and redeem them back should be perfectly legal under any government. I mean, we've done a lot of legal due diligence across lots of different countries, and you know, for that to be illegal is quite rare. Because it would make selling bus tickets very hard and other kinds of things, you know. So that's for one thing. On the second side, in terms of liquidity and creating scale for these types of instruments, this is where things like decentralized exchanges are very powerful, because there are ways to basically, if you think about the function of a money changer, right? So a money changer says, okay, look, I've got this invoice from Justin, right? Like I've got a voucher from Justin. He owes me some apples, but I don't need those apples right now. If in the meantime, there was a market where I could sell this voucher for apples for something I needed right now, right? That market function could be quite useful. And what the blockchain space has done is they've made the function of money changing into a contractual decentralized contract. Right. And so these contracts, generally they're called liquidity pools, right? They'll hold multiple digital assets, right? Like a voucher. They allow anyone to push into that pool, and they'll own a share of that pool, and they can actually, depending on the liquidity pool, they might make, you know, 0.02% on the volume in that pool, right? So it incentivizes connection and markets between value systems, and it can do that in a decentralized way. And I think it's extremely powerful. And I think, you know, if we get away from the crypto element of, you know, these volatile tokens that tend to crash and all this stuff, and just say, how could we create stable coins against actual goods and services with legal contract and massive global markets between them? I mean, of course, you know, these are going to be, you know, they're going to tend to grow to the scale of local markets. You know, also because of demurrage and stuff like this, there's going to be a tendency for them to sort of, you know, be bioregional and things like that. But still, like the ability to connect them together. So when people ask me, they say, oh, well, you know, how do you get people to use your voucher or your currency? And I say, don't do that. Like, help people make their own and create connections between them, right?
Just to follow up on that, I don't think anyone's here made up their minds about currencies. I think community currencies. But maybe, do you think the policymakers here should be worried or concerned or supportive of community currencies? In the sense that basically, if you look at it at the surface level, this is communities printing, making, and circulating their own money, right? So how should we think about that? Is that dangerous? Should policymakers be concerned? Are there risks or questions of accountability, or should it be something that has social value and therefore should be encouraged? I think that's the first question on their minds. What would you have to say to that?
There's rights and responsibilities. I think it is a human right. Credit is a human right. Like, for us to issue credit and create currency systems should be an absolutely human right. To take that away is going back to imperialism, and that's, we're still living in that state. So for an imperialistic government, that is basically enforcing with violence that you use only their currency, one, that should be frowned on. It should be illegal, with the UN. It should be really, really, considered a horrible thing. And for people to come together and say, okay, we are going to value our time just like the telecom company does, right? Because there's so many organizations already doing this, right? So if you're, so that's one thing to just look at by itself. And secondly, you can totally program in different taxation methods. So that demurrage, for instance, in our case, some of it does go to local authorities, and that provides funding for local authorities to provide mediation services to the community, right? And government can create their own of these as well. So I think if you were to look at the data and the impacts and the markets created, even in Italy just recently, just the trade of tax credits, acting as a secondary medium of exchange has been, a $30 million market in the last few months. It's huge, right? So creating these types of, so basically, decentralizing or opening the role for credit issuance instead of locking people away from creating trust measurements, I think is really important. And on the flip side, regulatory environment around these and mediation is super important. So there's rights and responsibility. If you're issuing a credit, right, and you sell it to people in kind, or, and then you don't accept it back, right, there should be repercussions. And there, so just going into Olstrom's, graduated sanctions, there should be, and here in Kenya, we've kind of tapped into how groups deal with debt in general, right? So there's generally 4 different ways. If you're not able to redeem the voucher that you issued, that's the same thing as being in debt, essentially, right? Someone has extended you credit, essentially. They've given you a service, you've given them a voucher, and they can't redeem the voucher, right? So you're in debt to them. And either they're going to forgive that debt, they'll have, they'll work with the village elders, and they'll talk about if there's an actual, a problem over extended period. They will have that person maybe do some work for the community funds or for the community garden, for instance. They will have that person pay the debt in another way, like chairs from their house, depending. Those are the main, or they'll roll over that debt into a next time period. So I think, having those types of rules in place and having frameworks. So we've built a license, sort of a nonprofit license around, like that people can opt into, that has a lot of these rules and obligations, for credit issuance and using these instruments. And we just call it a grassroots economics commons license. And then you're creating agreements under that license, right? So that's something we can talk about later. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. Christopher Guillaume, a colleague, has a question for both of you, David, Will, on the concept of trust. How does one build trust? Presumably, trust is at the foundations of the commons in an open and heterogeneous society like Singapore. David, would you like to take?
Well, I mean, it of course varies, but I think a lot of it has to do. One of our patterns of commoning was called ritualized togetherness. You need to do things together. And of course, time is a big function of building trust. You have to have these shared experiences over time to show that other people will deliver on what they say they will. And developing a shared culture with rituals, with celebrations and fun, all of that is about building the social connection and trust. And I think this is maybe what a lot of contemporary market societies have trouble engendering, because everything is a predatory market encounter as opposed to a community building affair often. So I think that's where commons can help, by developing this horizontal social connection, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of stewardship and responsibility for shared wealth. It helps build the kind of sense of security and trust that I think we need more of in modern life.
Thanks, David. Well, if I printed my own money, I will trust that it will work. How do you ensure trust? Complementary currencies.
I was just going to add as well to what David was saying, like those exercises where we'll get a group of people to sort of hold hands and even imagine, like, you know, you're receiving from this hand, from this person, you're giving to that hand something, you know, like, and people closing their eyes, doing those string games. They're extremely powerful and really heart opening, you know, and to me, trust is also about love. It's about expression and feeling safe in a community. And it's really invaluable, you know, just those, some of these basic real exercises of getting to know your neighbors, you know, talking, you know, meeting each other. So again, so this question of, like, you know, how would people trust my voucher? So this kind of goes back to, you know, you can take it to the, you know, why would you trust the telecom credit? Well, okay, they've got a business license, presumably they could be sued if they don't accept the credit back, you know. So legal contract, I think, is a good thing. It doesn't have to be legal in the sense where it's going to high court, but having graduated sanctions or mediation layers around that contract are important, and endorsements are also important. So if I'm looking at someone's community currency or their voucher, well, one, if it's on a public ledger, I can see every transaction that's ever happened. That's a lot of information that can be indexed in lots of different ways to create credit scoring. Secondly, I can look at public endorsements of that voucher also on that same ledger, right? So if there's a ledger that shows provable endorsement, provable transactions over time, I have a huge amount of data that someone can look at, you know, but that's, you know, not necessarily going to be your neighbor, right? So if your neighbor is questioning this and saying, okay, you know, Bob has issued a voucher, well, it is, you know, if they don't know you well or they don't have a sense of trust, it's going to be very hard. And that's why doing this as a mutual credit, where you don't do it as a single business, but you come in as a group, as a church or a community group or a group of businesses, you're de-risking your individual failure to redeem that credit. So it's much more stable in that sense. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. I'll just take one more question and then we'll move to the breakout room. Susanna from South Foundation has asked two questions. I'll kind of focus on the one for David and the second part of it. Can you briefly explain about the enclosure or privatization of shared wealth and how it's a threat to the commons? Maybe some examples of that.
Well, I first got into studying the commons from looking at the perspective of enclosures, meaning businesses, especially capitalists, investors, like nothing better than to get free or discounted resources. And a lot of that is about taking over shared wealth the way it did in the so-called English enclosure movement, where the early businessmen of modern capitalism colluded with the parliament and other government officials to seize land that was used as a commons and turn it into private market assets. So the privatization and marketization of shared wealth is what enclosure is all about. And it's a radical act of dispossession because it's taking away people's non-market access and use of things, and sometimes destroying their community and cultural identity, the way indigenous cultures or traditional communities in the global South have often been deprived through enclosure. But I think this is an across-the-board phenomena where you have businesses creating property rights in genes, or in nanomatter, in snippets of sound through copyright or trademark law. You know, so there's vast expansion of property rights in order to privatize them and trade them in the market, as opposed to having them shareable and benefiting a broader group of people. So that's what enclosure is all about. And the answer to it, I got into it through the commons through enclosure. I eventually came to see that the creating of alternatives that work, that get you out of the subordination and dispossession of enclosure, is the challenge. And that's where it's really important to, not be dependent and subordinate to predatory, impersonal global markets that you really can't deal with, and to try to create alternative commons-based circuits of value, as opposed to being roped into a market system in which, you're hostage to other people's business models or the whim of capital traders, on another continent. So that's enclosure in a nutshell. But the answer, I think, is creating types of alternatives that decommodify our relationship and give us greater peer governance and control.